I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, Times business writer Emma Goldberg investigates the disturbing trend in threats against healthcare executives. And then later on, New York Times climate reporter Austyn Gaffney discusses how the climate movement is reinventing itself as it awaits a political shift in Washington. But first, Zaina Erhaim is an award-winning Syrian journalist, feminist, and a refugee who's been living in Britain. In the Times this week, she shares a moving account of her life in Syria, ranging from childhood memories of military training at the age of 15 to the dramatic moment her mother woke her with the news of the end of Assad's regime. She joins us now from Iraq. And welcome, Zaina. Thank you for joining us. You talk about having led three lives, one growing up under al-Assad's father, another being a refugee in London, and now for a couple of days returning to Syria. What is Syria like under the absence of al-Assad?
Well, I haven't yet came to Syria, but I think the general atmosphere now for all of us Syrians, especially those who were engaged in the movement to topple the regime for over 14 years now, it's really disbelief. I think we're still trying to remind ourselves every second that the Syrian regime is not there, but it's still very hard to absorb. In any minute, we expect when someone is discovered, we are discovering new colleagues. We've been working with journalists for so long using pseudonyms, and for the first time ever, they're actually saying who they are, showing their faces. It seems like lots of people are being reborn now. So everything is so overwhelming that I don't think any of us is really stable enough to see what is happening or believing that we're actually not dreaming.
Zaina, a lot of the people involved in the new regime, or so far in the new regime, come from groups that have been previously labeled as extremist. And they got rid of al-Assad, who was clearly an authoritarian, a dictator. We saw in Iran, when the Shah was deposed, we wound up with the Ayatollah. So is there any confidence that things are going to be better in Syria or potentially worse for the people and for the relationship with the United States?
Well, what is sure is that things are going to be changing. And for now, I think the majority of Syrians are thinking about the relationship with other Syrians, with ourselves, rather than the US. I think the whole international community let Syrians down so many times that many Syrians, even those who used to be speaking to the Western world, are now backing to think again and directing their voices and their discussion towards Syrians themselves, because we learned in the last 14 years at least that we are completely on our own. Even when people were digging with their hands to look for secret prisons where our detainees are being kept, no help was sent by anyone. On the opposite, some organizations, some governments in the West were thinking about how they can get rid of the refugees instead of actually helping to figure out whether there are secret prisons, whether those missing people are connected with their families or not. So at this particular point, I think everyone is focusing on the internal relationships, Syrians, how we're going to be able to be stable, and how we will be able to stand up again. And for the first time in decades, we are hearing each other. We're hearing lots of new voices. It's a bit noisy, but we're hearing our voices for the first time.
Zaina, we've been reading a lot that the fall of al-Assad is a defeat for Russia, a defeat for Iran in the Middle East. Does that still seem to be the case?
I think certainly all those who took a stand with the regime or even stood on the neutral side are going to be losing. And Syrians, as everyone in the region, will do remember who stood with them and who took the side of the regime, whether it's by bombing them, whether it's by stopping them from finding a secure place to run to. And to be frank, I don't think we would remember lots of great things about the US neither.
You wrote about what it's like to be a journalist, a woman journalist in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. How have you coped with that?
Well, being a woman in patriarchal society is not easy in general, especially if that patriarchal society and sexist community is armed. So those traditions are generally enforced by weapons. However, I think the main difference now is that those Islamist groups were only controlling a small area that has a cohesion conservative community. But now it's all over Syria, where diverse people, different communities and minorities are living together. So I do believe that people started to speak up against any potential violations, and the resistance against any oppression is pretty much on the front line now. And maybe that's one of the few optimistic lenses that I can see now.
How is coverage by women, and you point out there are more and more women working as journalists, indigenous women, how has the coverage by women changed the perspective on what's going on in Syria and what is going on in the Middle East in general?
Sadly, I think different layers of oppression are applied on women. All of those who were taking decisions in the last 2 weeks on Syria, even from the Turkish, Russian, US, UN, they were literally all men. No women from any part was involved in any kind of discussions about our destiny. The new government, transitional salvatory governments, it's all men. So there is this kind of marginalization of women who have been taking leading roles on all levels. All those who I'm coordinating with and I'm in touch with who are looking for detainees and helping families are women. All of those who are helping the international journalists and missions looking for missing journalists inside Syria now are women. So it feels like this is happening again, but I think, or I hope, that now there's not going to be a turning point and women who spoke up so many times will be able to finally be present. And I hope the UN and the international community this time wouldn't put Syrian women into the second chair as advisors, but actually advocate and push for them to be decision makers as they should be.
At least until now, how free were you able to report from Syria what you saw that was actually going on?
I left Syria in 2016. At that point, I was only free to report some violations committed by the regime, but I wasn't able to commit to report about the violations committed either by the different Islamist groups that were controlling the areas or even any influential person, because it's so chaotic that you could be killed by accident and there is no authority or law to protect you from anything. Now I'm seeing more people finding their voices for the first time. I'm seeing more people encouraged. And I think one of the most powerful element that we have now is that unlike Eastern Aleppo and Idlib, now the scale and the number of people who are speaking up is really huge. And the geography of where those people exist is also big. So to silence them is going to be much more difficult than it was before, especially after, for the first time ever, they actually spoke up.
You wrote that you would have been a great target, someone a fighter would have been proud to have killed. How did you survive?
I think by accident and by the counting on social networks. There are always those good people who care. And I think our essence or our strength now is going back to those social values and networks and trying to connect with them. I think I wouldn't have been alive without the help of so many people who helped me once to escape when I was kidnapped by the regime militias earlier in the uprising, or when I was wanted for one of the Islamist groups for criticizing their violations on the other hand. So it's mainly Syrians who believed in change and who wanted to be free.
Zaina Erhaim, reporting from the Middle East, written in the New York Times this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, we'll talk with business writer Emma Goldberg about what the healthcare industry is doing to protect its executives. It was an incident that sent ripples through all of corporate America. UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson fatally shot last week on his way to an annual investor conference in Midtown. How has corporate security changed in an era where digital platforms have made corporate leaders increasingly vulnerable? New York Times business reporter Emma Goldberg joins us to discuss the intensifying anxiety. How have corporate leaders reacted to that shooting?
There's been a lot of panic within corporate America. I think that this incident really sent a chill through the community because they see how vulnerable they are. And this is actually coming after years in which companies have realized that they actually do need to spend more on their security. We've actually seen median spending on executive security double among the companies that disclose it in the S&P 500 over the last couple of years. So already there was, a heightening awareness of this issue, and now this incident has really made this a topic of conversation in corner offices.
Emma, we see more violence in America, we see more vitriol, but why have they specifically become more targeted?
There's a couple of different issues that are colliding here. So first of all, people are really angry at the health insurance industry. And when you think about it, this is happening all across America, that people's most frequent encounters with this industry are when they're trying to obtain coverage for a medical treatment or procedure for a loved one who is ill or suffering. And then they end up winding through these kind of Kafkaesque bureaucracies of people who won't answer their calls and then maybe deny their claims. So people have this rage that's been building up.
And they get greeted with a stamp that says no.
Exactly.
Right.
And then it kind of ends up being this faceless bureaucracy. Like when you think about it, Brian Thompson was not a household name. This was just, a person who a lot of people see as the face of an industry that has denied coverage to some of their loved ones. So I think that's one issue. And then another issue layered on top of that is that the internet has just made more available information about executives. You can go to a company website and see the faces and the names of the leaders of companies. On social media, you can see information about where they are. Sometimes you can even track the movements of their corporate jets. So we have more information than ever about who executive leaders are and where they are. And then the third layer on top of that is that social media is, an environment that's built to amplify vitriol and anger. People post things that are angry and filled with rage, and that actually, builds engagement with them online. So I think you have these three issues layered on top of one another. One is the anger people feel toward the healthcare and health insurance industry. The next is the information that they have about leaders in that industry. And the third is information environments that are built to amplify and spread anger.
Emma, we have enough trouble protecting public officials. How do we protect corporate officials?
A lot of companies are turning toward security firms, and these are like big expenditures on their budgets. So this is something that I think companies had sort of wanted to avoid spending on if they could, and now some of them are realizing more and more that they can't avoid this expenditure.
But if you were walking in Manhattan as a corporate executive and had two bodyguards with you, and someone comes up behind you with a gun and a silencer and tries to shoot you, can you really be protected?
The security firms say that having these kind of trained professionals can be helpful because they are trained to react to those sort of emergency situations, and they also know how to make sure that the movements of executives are not well known to the public and how to get them inside entrances and just traveling in safe ways. And I spoke to a couple of security firms that told me their phones were ringing off the hook after this incident last week. In particular, in the hours after the shooting took place, I spoke with a couple of firms that just said that they were on back-to-back calls with companies that were realizing they wanted to bring on additional security. One of them estimated that it could cost about $250,000 to have full protection for an executive for a year. But there's a really wide spectrum of things that companies can spend on. So it can range, they told me, anywhere from just sort of locking down their social media accounts to actually having security follow their children on college campuses or surveil their homes. So the spending and the particular strategies that companies can use vary really widely.
And you wrote in the Times that it's not just executives who are worried, it's employees of healthcare firms in general and probably some other companies too.
Yeah, I think workers in some of these companies are definitely rattled. And what we've seen is that this incident isn't like the first of its kind. I spoke with security firms that mentioned that they've seen all kinds of safety threats start to appear, particularly in the health insurance industry. So they told me, for example, about a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company that raised its drug prices. And then they had board members who received threatening phone calls anonymously. They had protesters show up to their homes. So we're seeing all kinds of different safety incidents. And they told me that there's also safety concerns within hospitals. So the companies and their leaders are rattled, but they also know that they're not without tools at their disposal.
You quote a Harvard Business School professor saying, "There's a lot of soul searching we have to do about an industry that consumes nearly 20% of our gross domestic product, and yet our outcomes are not nearly as good as countries that spend half as much." What is that soul searching going to accomplish, do you think?
Yeah, that was Ranjay Gulati, who's a wonderful professor at Harvard who spoke with me about this issue. And what we talked about is that, all you have to do is look at the fact that even highly compensated people are having to set up GoFundMe pages to crowdsource funding for medical treatments in this country. We've already started to see some indication that the shooter in this incident, Luigi Mangione, was suffering from health issues. Potentially, it seems like it could have been chronic back pains. I think it's important to note he had turned 26, which is the age that people age off their family's health insurance. So I think that it's very clear that there's many people in this country that want to obtain health treatments and procedures, and then they're struggling to get the coverage to do so. And in other countries that have, public options, that might not be the case. And so
with also higher taxes.
That's true. But I think that, logging into social media this week has been startling because we've seen posts on X and on Facebook and on Instagram and TikTok where there's been a flood, an outpouring of people's grief and frustration with the health insurance industry. And some are saying, of course, nobody should have to be killed for this, but there's been so much pain and so much suffering across the industry, and that anger has really, it feels like, reached a kind of boiling point. And so, as Professor Gulati pointed out to me, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations that happen within the health insurance industry, potentially, about why are people so angry and what can be done about that. So yes, there's the increased spending on corporate security, but there's also going to be conversations potentially about what can be done to address some of the vitriol, the frustration, the grief that's just pouring out from the American public, including on the internet, over this issue.
I'm going to make a giant leap to another subject involving corporate executives. Why are they taking psychedelic drugs these days?
It's a really good question. For a story that I published today, I went on a retreat called The Psychedelic CEO, where chief executives and people who run small businesses were taking psilocybin, which is the main psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms. And some of them were doing it to kind of emotionally unlock themselves. Some of them were doing it in the hopes of finding more creative ideas to apply to their companies. So what I see this is as the result of two separate trends in the corporate world. One is that there's been more and more of a premium put on creativity and imagination. It's no longer, the corporate world of rigid gray cubicles. We're now in a world that Silicon Valley has propelled us toward in a lot of ways, where there's openness to creative ideation and zany, colorful, whimsical ways of approaching work. So that's one. And the other is that the pandemic has sent anxiety skyrocketing, and people are searching for all kinds of ways to bring wellness and mental health conversations into the workplace. And it turns out that can even involve psychedelics for some people.
Did the mushrooms work?
You know, all of the executives I spoke with from this retreat said they had a really wonderful experience. One told me that he, has just felt a new sense of calm. And when he doesn't get to the to-do list, the end of his to-do list at the end of the day, he suddenly feels much more peaceful about it. Another told me that she was able to do some soul searching about why she's so averse to taking professional risks. And she ended up shifting into a new role at her company. So the particular CEOs I spoke with said it was, a really enlightening experience for them. I also spoke with some sort of bigger names, including Chip Conley, who used to be an executive at Airbnb. I spoke with Mark Williamson, who was at Masterclass, the former chief operating officer, and all of them told me they're just seeing psychedelics become much less taboo in the corporate world, but especially, unsurprisingly, out west in Silicon Valley.
Of course. Maybe we need it in the water supply.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us, Emma Goldberg of the New York Times. And coming up next, Times reporting fellow Austyn Gaffney. She'll discuss the evolving blueprint of climate justice movements. As the climate justice movement faces a second Trump presidency, it's been preparing for new challenges to its agenda. New York Times climate writer Austyn Gaffney recently wrote of the strategic transformation where advocates are shifting their focus. Now, there's been a first Trump administration. We survived that. The world survived that. Facing another 4 years of a Trump presidency, how serious is that in terms of the impact on the climate? Aren't we going to survive? Isn't the planet going to survive?
The planet is facing some serious challenges right now, I'd say, under a second Trump administration. We have 2024 could be the hottest year on record, and we're also spewing more carbon into the atmosphere than ever before, potentially in 2024 as well. So some big challenges that the climate is facing, and under a second Trump presidency, the climate movement is trying to adapt, basically. So instead of focusing so much on federal policies that they've focused on during the Biden administration, they're going to sort of move to more of the state and the local level and try and push for lowered carbon emissions and clean energy projects there instead of focusing so much on what will happen under Trump.
And how much jurisdiction do the states have in which they can sort of supersede federal regulation?
So they have quite a bit of bandwidth right now with the Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden passed in 2022, to sort of use grants, loans, and tax credits to build a larger manufacturing base for clean energy projects. So that's kind of where people are really focused right now, is making sure those clean energy projects like battery manufacturing or electric vehicles keep being developed in states and in counties, even though the Trump administration has said that they might roll back some of those parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. They're trying to get as much money out the door as possible right now so those projects can keep moving forward.
And Elon Musk is sort of more pro-climate than Trump has been. Is that a reason for optimism at all?
I don't know if it's something that necessarily folks in the climate movement are super focused on right now, at least the ones I spoke to. No one brought up Elon Musk as a potential person to kind of sway the incoming president, but they are focused on, again, those clean energy projects on a state and a local level and trying to make sure that those continue forward kind of no matter who is in office with Trump.
And again, how much damage can Trump actually do in 4 years, assuming he fulfills a lot of the things that he had been talking about?
So some things that Trump has said he could do or wants to do over the next 4 years include leaving the Paris Agreement, which is an international agreement intended to keep emissions at or near a level that would keep global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is this number that we all sort of know now. He's also said that he wants to revoke a tax credit that would lower the cost of electric vehicles, and he's also is planning to appoint people to key federal offices who either deny climate change or want to increase permitting for fossil fuel projects. So those things could be quite damaging. But again, The climate activists who I spoke to for this story focused mostly on what they could accomplish and not necessarily what Trump could repeal.
Not to minimize the problem or the challenges, 4 years of Trump is not going to kill the planet, is it?
So I asked this question to Jamie Henn, who runs an organization called Fossil Free Media. And basically his response was that in the next 4 years, we can again recalibrate, focus locally, but by 2028, we really need a president who will focus on moving climate legislation and climate policies forward and becoming a global leader again on the climate stage, so that by 2030, we can start reaching more of our climate goals. So no, 4 years will not undo all of the progress we've made, but they are making a big push to have a more climate-focused president in 2028.
Why was climate change not a big issue in the 2024 presidential campaign?
So there's a couple reasons people gave me for that. One is that the Democrats didn't have a primary, and so issues like climate change didn't really come to the forefront. And then another reason is climate leaders talked about needing to make a transition from talking about sort of the doom and gloom of climate change to more of the economic potential of, again, a clean energy transition. Mm-hmm. So part of that potential looks like more jobs. It looks like economies really growing, again, on a county or a state level. And so focusing more on that kind of progress versus the hazards of climate change is where people are really trying to reorient right now.
And we're beginning to see some of the effects right here at home, pollution, of course, congestion, and wildfires, and even in Prospect Park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so one of the focuses climate leaders have now is an act called the Climate Change Superfund Law that is in front of Governor Kathy Hochul's desk right now for her signature. So this week at the state capitol, organizers from groups like Fridays for Future, which is a youth group, and then Third Act, which is Bill McKibben's group for folks over 60, have all sort of coalesced at the Capitol to try and push Governor Hochul to sign that legislation.
And what would that legislation do?
So it's part of what people are calling polluter pay acts. And so basically it holds polluters to account. So folks, companies that have spewed a lot of carbon into the atmosphere would be required to pay billions of dollars over a number of years to help states like New York adapt to climate change.
Sounds like a good idea. Austyn Gaffney of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. That's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm Sam Roberts, and don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.